I came home from war to find my mailbox empty. 8 months of mail, gone. My neighbor's guilty face told me everything. She threw it all away, he whispered. The HOA lady said soldiers don't deserve mail. That's when I knew Karen had picked the wrong veteran to mess with. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. My name is Marcus Chin, and I just returned from my second tour in Afghanistan with the Army Corps of Engineers. The transition from the constant vigilance of a war zone to the suburban quiet of Meadowbrook Heights was always jarring, but this felt different. This felt personal. I dropped my duffel bag on the porch and walked to the community mailbox cluster at the end of our cul-de-sac. My key still worked, but inside my designated box was nothing but a small, typed note on official HOA letterhead. Mail service suspended due to property violations. Contact HOA board immediately. My blood ran cold. Property violations? I'd left my house in perfect condition, lawn service paid for 6 months in advance, everything by the book. I'd specifically chosen this neighborhood because the HOA rules were clear and reasonable, or so I thought. The next morning, I knocked on Jim's door. He answered with a guilty expression that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Marcus, thank God you're back safe," he said, but wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried to stop her, man. I really did. Stop who? What happened to my mail? Jim glanced around nervously, then pulled me inside. It's Patricia Whitmore, the new HOA president. She's been throwing it away. The words hit me like a mortar blast. Throwing it away? What do you mean throwing it away? She claimed your grass was a 1/4 inch too long after the lawn service missed a week due to equipment problems. Said it was a health hazard and an eyesore. She got the mail suspended, then when mail started piling up at the post office, she somehow convinced them to let her collect it as HOA president. I saw her throwing bags of it into the community dumpster. I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest, the same feeling I'd get when we'd find IEDs targeting school children. The rage of injustice, of bullies using their small power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. Except I could fight back. I just had to be smart about it. How long has this been going on? 3 months, Jim said quietly. Marcus, some of those letters, they looked official. Government stuff. I tried to fish some out, but she's got the whole board intimidated. She's turned this place into her personal kingdom. I thanked Jim and walked back to my house, my mind racing. 3 months of mail. That meant veteran benefit communications, bank statements, insurance documents, possibly legal notices. This wasn't just some petty HOA power trip. This was federal mail tampering, and it had cost me months of important correspondence. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. Photos of my lawn, which looked perfectly fine, copies of my lawn service contract, my deployment orders showing I was overseas, my mail forwarding arrangements. If Patricia Whitmore wanted to play games, she'd picked the wrong veteran. The next step was confronting her directly. I found her address in the HOA directory and knocked on her door that evening. The woman who answered was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wearing a pastel cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. Her smile was plastic and condescending. "You must be Mr. Chen," she said, looking me up and down with obvious disapproval. "I suppose you're here about your mail situation." "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm here because you've been illegally intercepting and destroying federal mail. I want to know exactly what you threw away and why." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes turned ice cold. "I don't appreciate your tone, young man. The HOA has clear guidelines about property maintenance, and your lawn was in violation for weeks. When homeowners abandon their properties, we have procedures to follow." Abandon? The word came out sharper than I intended. I was serving my country in Afghanistan. I had lawn service arranged and my property was in perfect compliance. Your lawn service failed to maintain the 2-inch maximum height requirement on multiple occasions. The board voted unanimously to suspend your mail privileges until you could demonstrate consistent compliance with community standards. I stared at her, amazed by the casual cruelty in her voice. "You can't suspend mail privileges. That's not legal. And you definitely can't throw away someone's mail. I think you'll find that the HOA covenant gives us broad authority to maintain community standards. Perhaps if you'd been more involved in community affairs instead of gallivanting around the world, you'd understand how things work here." Gallivanting. She'd called my military service gallivanting. "Ma'am," I said, my voice deadly calm, "I need you to understand something very clearly. What you've done is a federal crime. Tampering with mail carries serious penalties. I'm giving you one chance to make this right." She laughed, actually laughed. Are you threatening me? I'll have you know my husband is a retired police chief, and we have connections throughout this county. Your little soldier act doesn't intimidate me. That's when I knew she'd never had anyone stand up to her before. She was used to intimidating people with threats and social pressure. But I'd faced down Taliban fighters and corrupt officials. A suburban HOA tyrant wasn't even a warm-up. This isn't a threat, Mrs. Whitmore. It's information. You have 24 hours to provide me with a full accounting of every piece of mail you intercepted, and you're going to help me recover anything that can be recovered. Or I'm going to the postal inspectors, the police, and the local news. Your choice. Her face flushed red. How dare you? I'll have you evicted from this community. I'll make your life a living hell. You already tried that, I said, turning to leave. Now you get to find out what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows how to fight back. I spent that night researching. Mail tampering wasn't just a minor offense, it was a federal felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The Postal Inspection Service took it seriously, especially when it involved veterans' benefits or government correspondence. I also discovered that Patricia Whitmore had a history of similar complaints from other residents, but no one had ever filed formal charges. The next morning, I drove to the post office and spoke with the postmaster, a stern woman named Linda who'd been running the place for 20 years. When I explained the situation and showed her my deployment orders, her expression darkened. She told us she was collecting mail for an abandoned property, Linda said. She had HOA documentation that looked official. But if you're saying you never abandoned the property and never authorized her to collect your mail. I never authorized anything. And I have proof I arranged for mail forwarding, which she somehow interfered with. Linda pulled up my account on her computer. Oh, this is bad. There's a note here that mail forwarding was canceled at the request of the HOA due to property abandonment. But I'm looking at your forwarding request, and there's no indication you were abandoning the property. Someone lied to us. What kind of mail are we talking about? Linda's fingers flew over the keyboard. Veterans Affairs benefits correspondence, bank statements, insurance documents, IRS notices. Mr. Chin, some of this mail was time-sensitive. You could have missed important deadlines. The implications hit me like a freight train. My VA disability evaluation, my GI Bill housing allowance, possibly tax documents. Patricia Whitmore hadn't just violated my privacy, she'd potentially cost me thousands of dollars in critical benefits I'd earned with my service. I want to file a formal complaint, I said. I'll connect you with the postal inspectors immediately. Inspector Sarah Rodriguez arrived at my house that afternoon. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who listened to my story with the intensity of someone who took mail crimes personally. Mail tampering cases involving veterans are priority for us, she said after I'd shown her all my documentation. The fact that she specifically targeted someone deployed overseas makes this even more serious. Do you have any evidence of the actual disposal? I thought about Jim's story of seeing her at the dumpster. I have a witness who saw her throwing mail away. And the post office has records of her falsifying information about property abandonment. That's mail fraud on top of mail tampering. Mr. Chin, we're looking at federal felony charges here. Are you prepared to see this through to prosecution? I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake in Afghanistan, worrying about things back home, trusting that my community would look out for me the way I was looking out for them. I thought about the other veterans in the neighborhood who might face similar harassment. I thought about Patricia Whitmore's smug smile when she called my service gallivanting. Yes, ma'am. I'm prepared. The investigation moved quickly. Inspector Rodriguez obtained warrants for the HOA's records and Patricia's personal communications. They interviewed Jim and other neighbors who'd witnessed her behavior. They pulled security footage from the community area that showed her multiple trips to the dumpster with mail bags. But the smoking gun came from Patricia herself. Apparently, she'd been documenting her community improvement efforts in detailed emails to other board members. The emails were a masterclass in petty tyranny, describing how she was cleaning up the neighborhood by getting rid of undesirable elements, like absentee homeowners who clearly don't care about community values. One email, sent 2 weeks after I'd deployed, was particularly damning. The Chun property continues to be a problem. I've arranged to have his mail intercepted until he can prove he's committed to maintaining HOA standards. Absent homeowners need to understand there are consequences for neglecting their community responsibilities. When Inspector Rodriguez showed me that email, I felt something I hadn't experienced since combat, the cold satisfaction of seeing an enemy reveal their position. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. I was working in my garage when I heard the commotion outside. Patricia Whitmore was standing in her driveway in a bathrobe and slippers, handcuffs gleaming on her wrists, while Inspector Rodriguez read her rights. "This is ridiculous," Patricia was shouting. "I was protecting the community. These people don't understand property values. My husband will have your jobs." Her husband, the retired police chief, stood silently beside her with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. He knew exactly how serious federal charges were, and he knew his wife had crossed a line that even his connections couldn't uncross. The neighborhood had gathered to watch. I saw relief on some faces, people who'd been terrorized by Patricia's tyrannical leadership for months. Others looked shocked, as if they couldn't believe their HOA president was being arrested like a common criminal. As they loaded her into the postal inspector's vehicle, Patricia spotted me in my garage. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You ruined everything. I was trying to protect this community from people like you. People like me. Veterans. People who served their country and expected basic respect in return." The aftermath was swift and thorough. The Postal Service investigation uncovered that Patricia had been tampering with mail for over a year, targeting anyone she deemed undesirable, which included an elderly widow she thought was too old to maintain her property, a young Hispanic family she claimed was bringing down the neighborhood, and a disabled veteran who used a wheelchair and required accessibility modifications to his home. The criminal charges were devastating. Mail tampering, mail fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was a former Marine who took a personal interest in the veteran-targeting aspects of Patricia's crimes. But the civil consequences were almost worse for someone like Patricia. Every person whose mail she'd tampered with filed lawsuits. The HOA's insurance dropped them. Property values actually started declining as word spread about the toxic leadership and legal liabilities. I recovered what I could of my missing mail, but some damage was permanent. I'd missed a critical deadline for a VA disability appeal that cost me months of back pay. My credit score had taken a hit from misstatements I never received. But the Postal Service and VA worked with me to reconstruct what happened and minimize the long-term impact. The most satisfying moment came during Patricia's sentencing hearing. Her lawyer had tried to paint her as a dedicated community volunteer who'd made poor decisions under stress. But when the judge asked if she had anything to say, Patricia couldn't help herself. "Your Honor, I was trying to maintain property values and community standards. These people need to understand that living in a quality neighborhood comes with responsibilities. If they can't follow simple rules..." "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge interrupted, "you tampered with a deployed serviceman's mail because his grass was slightly too long. You destroyed government correspondence intended for a wounded veteran. You used your position of trust to target people based on their race, age, and disability status. There are no community standards that justify federal crimes." She got 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release and community service. More importantly, she was banned from serving on any HOA board and had to pay restitution to everyone whose mail she tampered with. The new HOA board, elected after Patricia's arrest, was a completely different animal. They implemented strict oversight procedures, term limits, and a formal complaint process with external review. They even established a fund to help homeowners who'd been harassed under Patricia's regime. 6 months later, I was working in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to Patricia's old house. The new neighbors were a young military family. The husband was a Navy corpsman being transferred to the local base. I walked over to introduce myself and help them understand the community. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking the husband's hand. "I'm Marcus Chin. If you need anything or have any problems with the HOA, let me know. We've worked hard to make this a place where military families are respected." His wife looked relieved. "We heard there had been some issues with the previous leadership." "There were," I said, watching their kids run around the yard with the boundless energy of military children who'd moved too many times to count. "But we fixed them. Sometimes it takes someone willing to stand up to bullies to protect the community for everyone else." That evening, I sat on my back deck with a beer, watching the sunset over the perfectly maintained lawns of Meadowbrook Heights. My grass was exactly 2 inches high, not because I was afraid of the HOA but because I actually liked it that way. The difference was that now it was my choice. I thought about the letters Patricia had thrown away, the stress and financial hardship she'd caused, the nights I'd lain awake in Afghanistan worrying about problems back home that turned out to be entirely manufactured by one person's petty cruelty. But I also thought about the community we'd built in the aftermath, neighbors who looked out for each other, an HOA that served residents instead of terrorizing them, and a place where military families could come home to peace instead of more conflict. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 8 months in a war zone protecting American freedoms, only to come home and have to fight for those same freedoms against someone who wrapped her tyranny in the flag of community standards. But that's the thing about service, it doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes protecting your community means standing up to the Patricia Whitmores of the world, even when it would be easier to just keep your head down and comply. My phone buzzed with a text from Inspector Rodriguez. Saw the news story about the new HOA board election. Glad to see the community healing. How are you adjusting to civilian life? I typed back, better every day. Turns out the skills you learn in the military, leadership, integrity, standing up for what's right, are just as valuable in suburbia. Her response made me smile. Patricia's parole officer says she's been a model prisoner. Apparently she's learned that rules apply to everyone, even HOA presidents. As darkness fell over Meadowbrook Heights, I could see lights in windows, families gathering for dinner, kids playing in yards without fear of arbitrary violations and fines. It was the America I'd fought for overseas, a place where people could live in peace, where justice mattered more than social status, where no one could abuse their authority without consequences. The next morning brought validation in an unexpected form. I was drinking coffee on my porch when a news van pulled up. A reporter I recognized from the local station got out, followed by a cameraman. Mr. Chin? I'm Diana Martinez from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Meadowbrook Heights HOA case. Would you be willing to share your experience? I'd avoided media attention during the investigation and trial, wanting to handle things through proper legal channels. But now that justice had been served, maybe it was time to tell the story publicly. Other veterans, other communities might benefit from knowing that HOA tyranny wasn't something they had to endure silently. What angle are you taking? I asked. The importance of accountability in community leadership, and how one person's abuse of power affected an entire neighborhood. We've interviewed several other victims of Mrs. Whitmore's actions, but your case was the catalyst that brought everything to light. We did the interview in my front yard, with my perfectly maintained 2-inch grass as a backdrop. Diana asked thoughtful questions about my service, the mail tampering, and the legal process. But the question that hit deepest was about the emotional impact. How did it feel to come home from serving your country only to face this kind of harassment? I paused, choosing my words carefully. It felt like betrayal. When you're deployed, you trust that the people back home will honor the sacrifice you're making. You don't expect to come home and find that someone has weaponized the very community you were fighting to protect. What would you say to other veterans who might be facing similar situations? Document everything. Know your rights. And don't be afraid to fight back through proper legal channels. The law is on your side even when it feels like the whole world is against you. What Patricia Whitmore did wasn't about maintaining community standards, it was about power and control. And in America, no one gets to wield that kind of power without accountability. The story aired that Thursday evening. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from veterans organizations, legal aid societies, and other homeowners facing HOA abuse. Apparently, our case had become a symbol of something larger: the need for accountability in community governance and protection for service members and their families. One call stood out. It was from Colonel Sarah Mitchell, my former commanding officer, who'd seen the news story. "Chin, I always knew you were a fighter," she said. "But taking down a corrupt HOA president? That might be your most impressive victory yet. Just applied the same principles we learned in the Army, ma'am. Protect the community, stand up to bullies, and always fight for what's right." Well, your timing was perfect. The Pentagon is launching a new initiative to protect military families from HOA harassment during deployments. They want to use your case as a model for how to respond to these situations. Interested in being a consultant? 3 months later, I found myself briefing military legal officers and family readiness group leaders on HOA laws and service member protections. Patricia Whitmore's attempt to silence one veteran had inadvertently created a nationwide support network for military families facing similar harassment. The final chapter of the story came almost a year later. I was at my mailbox, which now received a steady stream of mail without interference, when I noticed a familiar figure across the street. Patricia Whitmore was loading boxes into a small moving truck, her house sporting a "sold" sign. She looked up and saw me watching. For a moment, our eyes met across the suburban battlefield where we'd waged our war. I expected anger, defiance, maybe even a final attempt at intimidation. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: shame. She looked away quickly and disappeared into the house. 20 minutes later, the moving truck drove away, carrying her to whatever new community would have to deal with the consequences of her inability to learn from her mistakes. I never saw Patricia Whitmore again, but her legacy lived on in the positive changes she'd inadvertently sparked. The new HOA leadership was transparent and accountable. Community meetings actually addressed residents' concerns instead of serving as platforms for authoritarian grandstanding. Property values recovered and continued rising as word spread that Meadowbrook Heights had cleaned house and become a genuinely desirable place to live. But the most meaningful change was personal. I'd come home from war feeling disconnected from civilian life, uncertain about my place in a community that often seemed to take military service for granted. Fighting Patricia Whitmore had reminded me that the values I'd learned in the Army, integrity, courage, selfless service, weren't just military concepts. They were the foundation of good citizenship, whether you were defending democracy overseas or protecting your neighbors from petty tyrants at home. Standing in my driveway that evening, looking at my perfectly maintained 2-inch grass and the lights coming on in houses throughout our community, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my first deployment. I was home. Not just physically but spiritually. This was my community, these were my people, and I'd helped make it a place worth fighting for. The mail came every day now, delivered without drama or interference to neighbors who respected each other's service and sacrifice. It was a small thing really, mail delivery. But sometimes the smallest freedoms are the ones most worth protecting. And somewhere in my files, I kept a copy of that first HOA notice I'd found in my mailbox. Not as a reminder of injustice, but as proof that sometimes one person willing to stand up and fight back can change everything for the better. The American dream isn't just about the freedom to succeed. It's about the freedom to live in peace in your own community, to serve your country without fear of retaliation from petty tyrants, and to know that when injustice occurs, there are still people willing to fight for what's right. Patricia Whitmore thought she could intimidate a veteran into silence. Instead, she discovered that some people fight harder when they're fighting for others. And in the end, that made all the difference.